When people say, well, why do we sleep? It's a bit like asking, well, why are we awake? There's a whole bunch of essential stuff going on that is not just an indulgence or a luxury, but essential for our ability to function. Now, short-term sleeping pill use, not a problem. I mean, it may be useful just to correct a problem that you've been having, but it's where you become dependent upon some sort of sleeping pharmacology to sedate you every night. And it's really important to make the distinction, because what many of these drugs will do is actually impede some of the important things going on within the brain. Alcohol, which is perhaps the most frequently used sedative across the developed and the developing world, has a big effect on memory consolidation and information processing. So you're not inducing sleep, you're inducing sedation. I guess my feeling would be try and avoid anything, even something like melatonin. And certainly, for example, airline pilots are told not to take melatonin. And the problem is, if you don't know where the clock is, then you actually might take it at the wrong biological time. And even though it has a mild effect, it might actually interfere with the body's natural process.
Would you take it for jet lag?
I used to. When I first went to Australia quite a bit, I used to take it. But then actually I think it was doing more harm than good. And I think the advice to pilots was quite correct. Because if you don't quite know where your internal rhythms are, you might be hitting the body at the wrong biological time. And so I don't use anything now. I mean, I think the key thing for jet lag is light. Essentially, what you need to do, and the rule of thumb is straightforward. If you're traveling west, you seek out light and you adapt to an expanding day. If you're traveling east, you have to be slightly careful, because light can do different things at different times. Rule of thumb is you avoid morning light in the new location and seek out afternoon light, and that will speed up the time in which you can pull the clock forward to re-establish your sleep-wake patterns.
So if you're flying from here to America, you try and you'd want to get the earliest flight you can and then maximize the amount of daylight you see.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah. And what I tend to do for Australia is I'll take a flight where I arrive there at their nighttime. So I'm not exposed to light at a time in London or the UK where I'd actually push my clock back towards Europe rather than drag it forward to Australia.
In terms of quality of sleep, is there a higher quality if you're going to bed before, say, midnight?
Yeah. And there is that myth that, an hour before midnight is better than 2 hours after. There's no real evidence for that. But we sort of touched on the fact that there are different stages of sleep. And so you have this sort of 60 to 90 minute cycle of non-REM versus REM sleep. And we have about 4 or 5 of those episodes. And in non-REM sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep, we have this sort of slow rolling waves of brain activity. And that's been linked to memory consolidation and the processing of information. And so that's why people have suggested that first, and you get much more slow wave sleep during the first half of the night than you do during the second half of the night, when there's more REM sleep. And REM sleep has been associated with the processing of emotional information. And it's, of course, REM sleep is when we have our most vivid and clearest dreams. But really, we don't know. I mean, these are correlations, and it's getting better. But I'm sure we'll find lots of different things over the next 10 years.
So at the moment, there is no evidence, as far as we know, or that going to bed earlier is producing a higher quality sleep, or are you suggesting that intuitively it might?
Okay, so it depends on your body clock type. If you're a morning type, you like to get up early and go to bed early, then absolutely let your biology take control and stick to it. Most of us tend to be later types, and the problem with us later types, we then do lots of other stuff as well. So we're biologically inclined to go to bed later, and then we fill those hours before bedtime with lots of exciting activity, whether it's the box set or gaming or whatever, and so we make it even worse. So I think work out, again, it's rather a tedious mantra, but work out what's best for you. And if you're a morning type, stick to it. I mean, the real irony is, of course, if asked, does your preferred sleep schedule interfere with either your work schedule or your social schedule, all the morning types say work, no problem at all. But it's hateful in terms of my social schedule, because everybody wants me to stay up late on a Friday and a Saturday night, and I'm just exhausted. And if I don't, they call me sort of a party pooper. So it's interesting that for work, early chronotypes are better than late chronotypes.
I did some research around whether we have a sort of genetic disposition to being sort of
Yes.
morning or night people, and
Yeah.
I was told I might have a polymorphism on my period 3 gene, I believe, which
Right. Oh, brilliant. Yes.
probably means an awful lot to you and not much to me. But can you? I mean, I'm always been a night person and find mornings hellish. Can you battle? Can you shift that, or do you just have to resolve yourself that that's how you're wired?
And you're quite right. There is a genetic basis to morningness and eveningness, and you happen to have one of those polymorphisms. And I guess if you asked relatives, a few of your relatives would also say, "Oh yeah, I'm always a late type," or whatever. And you can. And it's a fun, actually, set of discussions, across families. Light can help you here, so the background is that morning light advances the clock, makes you get up earlier. Evening light delays the clock, makes you get up later. And it relates to that jet lag thing we were talking about. So when we were all agricultural workers, we got a vaguely symmetrical exposure to morning and evening. So we were advanced and delayed in a sort of a way in which we stayed on cue. We did a study on university students around the world, published, I think, in 2018. And it was absolutely brilliant because university students have a more relaxed sort of scheduling. We showed that the later the chronotype, the more owl-like, the more evening light they got, delaying the clock, and they weren't getting any morning light at all. So if you're a late type and you need to be much more of a morning type, set the alarm, expose yourself to bright environmental light. It'll be brutal for 3 or 4 days, and then you'll notice that naturally you'll be getting up earlier. But the key thing is that morning light, and so you can to some extent advance the clock by giving yourself morning light.
And is it as simple as maybe not drawing the curtains?
No, you need quite bright light, and that's the really important thing, is that there are specialized receptors within the eye, quite different from the cells that we use for vision, the rods and cones. And we discovered that there are these cells which are light sensitive and actually go into the brain and regulate the master clock. Now, they need quite a bit of light. So light at which you can comfortably read by is not going to be effective at shifting the clock. You need average office lighted conditions are 200 to 600 lux. By a window, you should get 3,000 lux. Outside, looking out the window now, it'll be something of 60, 70,000 lux. And a bright sunny day can get up to 100,000 lux. And what we know is the clock needs to see hundreds to thousands of lux to robustly set itself. So if you can get outside, great. If you can't, then you can get a light box that is producing, several thousand lux, and you need to sit there broadly exposed to that light for at least half an hour or so.
So, I mean, as it happens, and I have an SAD light on my desk.
Oh, right, yes.
I don't know, it would be quite good for the lighting, if nothing else here. Are you saying that if I want to become more of a morning person, I should put that by my bed?
Yeah.
Wake up in the morning and switch that on?
Absolutely, yeah. And why not do it? Keep a sleep diary. Note when you get up, and keep it for a week beforehand, and then do that and see if it helps.
Presumably, you actually need your eyes open as well.
Well, yes and no. Quite a bit of light actually gets through the eyelids. And the extraordinary thing about these new receptors is that they're very good at counting light over long periods of time. The visual system grabs light and then forgets it's seen it in a fraction of a second to make an image of our world. Otherwise, we'd be living in a complete visual smear. What these specialized receptors do is they act as dosimeters. They count up the amount of light. And there's some evidence, there's a couple of papers published fairly recently showing that if you had a light that simulated a twilight in the morning, that was actually quite effective. And so it was ramping up slowly to a bright light, but you could detect it through the closed eyelids. That was actually pretty good at setting the clock.
Fascinating. And if people have had sleep issues for a long time, maybe insomnia, waking up, how quickly does it take to turn the ship around?
Well, it depends on the nature of the condition. A lot of the problems that people have with sleep is that they're just out of kilter with what's being expected of them. So they may be a late type, for example, expected to be at work at 8 o'clock in the morning. And of course, that's the classic problem with students. Students are classically late types for not only light exposure reasons, but also biological reasons. Like it seems as though from about the age of 10 to the early 20s, there's a tendency to go to bed later and later and later. And then from the early 20s, you then start to go to bed earlier and earlier and earlier again. And that sharp rise from 10 to the early 20s, and then the slow slide into old age, almost exactly mirrors the circulating levels of progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen. And so there's probably a hormonal influence. And in fact, it can be quite big. So it's been calculated that somebody in the early teens, late 20s will want to get up and go to bed about 2 hours later than somebody in their late 50s, early 60s. So asking a teenager to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning is a bit like asking a 55-year-old to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, I mean, there are these other biological events, but as I say, they can be partly modulated.
But the notion of 6 hours minimum might feel arbitrary, or 8 is ideal. But is there a difference between 6 hours and 8 hours sleep in general, or is it very much dependent on the individual?
If you need more sleep and are only getting 6 hours, you will be impaired. Yes, that's for sure. And some studies have shown, for example, sleep restriction in healthy young males. Their metabolic axis changes, so they eat more because the hunger hormone goes up. Their empathy, their ability to process information is all significantly affected. So, and these are all signs, of course, that you're not getting enough sleep and you need to get more. So, yeah, absolutely. If you can genuinely manage on 6 hours, and very few can, but a few can, then that's great. But most of us will need significantly more than 6 hours to function optimally.
Mm. You say that the number of hours is very subjective, and some people might be Thatcherites, others more like students.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Margaret Thatcher's a very interesting example. I mean, she basically overwrote, her biological program, and I wouldn't say that lack of sleep causes dementia and Alzheimer's, but if you're predisposed, there is that increased risk. And we're finding out now that disrupted sleep in the middle years can actually give an increased risk to dementia and Alzheimer's. So we're very good at overriding our biology by activating the stress axis. And so we simply, that's what night shift workers are doing. They're all of their biology is trying to put them to sleep. And yet they're functioning vaguely because they've activated the stress axis, which is sort of just suppressing this biological need to sleep. But that has consequences. I mean, the stress axis is amazing. I liken it to an engine. Putting an engine into first gear, gives you that huge acceleration, allows you to get out of trouble. But if you keep the engine in first gear, then you're going to destroy the engine. And that's a bit like keeping the stress axis on full time in first gear. So I think this is very careful. And people who are tired are really good at deluding themselves. I mean, there's some nice studies in taxi drivers, night shift taxi drivers, and you say, do you have any problems working at night? And they say, no, it's fine. It's no problem to me at all. And for a small number, it won't be, because they're extreme late types, biologically late types. But if you take most of them into the lab and you do cognitive testing, processing of information, reaction times, they're hopeless. It's, they really are impaired. But as I say, we're really good at fooling ourselves. So you have to genuinely listen to your own body needs, and sort of embrace those needs.
Where disrupted sleep is perhaps unavoidable, you might have small children, whether it's work or you just have stress that's kind of keeping you up. What is the best way to try? And given that, there are some fairly fundamental processes which are being disrupted, as you've outlined, how can you try and recoup some of that?
Well, a lot of people will be sleep deprived during the week and then oversleep at weekends and think they can catch up. And you can a bit, but not completely. And that's because of the two timers. And again, it goes back to the night shift problem. So what's happening is that you are short of sleep, the sleep pressure rises, and that will want to put you to sleep. But if you're trying to sleep at a time when the clock says, hang on, this is daytime, you should be awake, you're going to get very shortened sleep. And that's the real problem with night shift workers. They finish the night shift with huge sleep needs, huge sleep pressure. So they fall asleep very quickly, but the clock is saying, hang on, it's daytime, you should be up and working. And so it rapidly wakes them up. So they're only getting 4 to 5 hours sleep in a single block, which is for many not enough.
If you unavoidably are having disrupted sleep, kids, stress, whatever it is, would you suggest some sort of siesta, some meditation later in the day? What would you recommend?
And I was very skeptical about things like mindfulness and all of it. It seemed too close to crystal waving for me as a cellular molecular physiologist, neuroscientist. But actually, I've been pretty convinced that if you develop these techniques, which are essentially relaxation techniques of calming you down, then these can be incredibly beneficial. So meditation and mindfulness has shown to be very effective in some people at regulating, at improving their sleep. Naps you have to be a bit careful with. The evidence suggests that a 20-minute nap in the middle of the day can increase your performance for the second half of the day. Longer than 20 minutes, you tend to go deeper into sleep, and recovery from that can make you fuzzy and groggy and can counterbalance that usefulness of the nap. The thing you've got to be very careful about is that naps aren't close to bedtime, because what happens is that it pushes back the sleep pressure, which means that you'll go to sleep later. And of course, that's the classic problem with teenagers. They are chronically sleep deprived. They've had very short sleep at night. The alarm clock is getting them out of bed. They're struggling through the school. They get home. They then have a 2-hour nap, which is relatively close to bedtime, late afternoon, early evening, which means that they push back the sleep pressure, which means they'll go to sleep later that night, much later that night. And so they get into a cycle of shortened and shortened nighttime sleeps and longer daytime naps. So sure, occasional nap, not a problem, but be careful you're not sliding into that longer nap, shorter night sort of cycle.
And if you're waking up and you're feeling knackered, that's a sign of what?
Well, you have to be careful, because it's important to distinguish between fatigue and sleepiness. Fatigue is certainly tiredness, but it's also a lethargy and a failure to be motivated. And that may reflect an underlying problem. So, for example, depression or some other physiological illness. And it is not necessarily cured by sleep. Tiredness, sleepiness, has an obvious cure, and that's sleep. It's important to distinguish between the two. So if you're getting enough sleep, but still feeling fatigued, then you need to go and see your GP and get some specialist help.
Now you've no doubt come across some very different ways to sleep around the world. Are there any particular cultures or societies which stand out as approaching sleep in a completely different way to us?
Oh, absolutely. And we kind of touched on this earlier, which is those societies in South America who don't have any electric light. So the villages don't have any electric light whatsoever. And so what happens is that they show this very relaxed attitude towards sleep and relaxation. So at twilight, there's a 2-hour quietening, settling down of sort of, just relaxation. 4 hours of consolidated sleep, wake up, interact, move around, another 4 hours of sleep, and then a 2-hour slow sort of waking from that. And I have a friend who's based in Munich, and he's studying actually a society in South America before and after the introduction of electric light. And I think we tend to think, we're divorced from all those natural signals, but another colleague, Ken Wright, based at Denver, he looked at university students at their sleep-wake timing for a week in their normal environment, and then a week after camping in the Rocky Mountains, where they only had exposure to natural light and a little bit of firelight, no apps, no nothing, and their sleep-wake pattern expanded and got earlier. So they were, and it was a very nice illustration of how the environment can interact with our sleep. And I think what's happened in much of our society is that our sleep has been compressed into a single window, and so we tend not to show this biphasic or polyphasic sleep pattern.
Actually, if you look at people's living without electricity, do you think our natural way of sleeping would have been to have 2 main sleeps?
All the evidence suggests that. In fact, there was a study that came out of the States a few years ago, taking people from our society, putting them into a sort of a room with 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark, and they didn't have access to additional light during the dark, and their sleep patterns changed completely to a much more biphasic and polyphasic pattern, which is really important to remember. When people wake up, they shouldn't get so anxious about it, because they're probably reverting back to a much more ancestral pattern of sleep. And so one's sleep pattern would expand and contract over the seasons as dawn and dusk shifted. And some people argue that seasonal affective disorder, that winter blues, is actually a biological throwback to the times when we needed to, during the winter months, conserve energy, not move around as much, and where we could get carbohydrates, get as much of it as we possibly can to sustain us. And so, I think our sleep patterns were much more dynamic and much more variable in the recent past, even to the times of the mid-Victorians.
Have you tried to replicate this yourself ever?
No, I haven't. Although I do defend my sleep. I'm a late type, and you can be damn sure that in the lab we don't have meetings that start at 8 o'clock in the morning. And one of the great things of becoming a professor is I could decide when the meetings occurred. We start at 10, but we can be there much later, and that fits in perfectly, of course, with the more delayed body clocks of my younger co-workers.
I couldn't agree more. Ours is a 10 o'clock start as well.